put so much in here, so I had to filter a lot out. But I think this will be fun. Let's see here. So the path of productivity, I am pulling together a bunch of things, trying to sort of knowledge share my experience being a developer for almost 30 years now, if you count from when I was young. And so some of these will be sharing concrete ideas that I think that I've learned for myself, but some of it's just a philosophy of how to be a self-improving developer. And I think a lot of this applies to design as well as development when you're trying to produce something. But I'm going to be talking specifically to developers. So here is the breakdown of what I'm going to talk about today, with most of the emphasis going to be, it's going to get longer towards the end and shorter up at the front, but I wanted to define some terms clearly. And so we're going to start with mastery. And I'm experimenting with a new slideshow tool called beautiful.ai, and they're in beta, but it's free. Mixed reviews at the moment, but it does allow you to make really pretty slides quick, and they've got tons and tons of totally free clip art. And so I'm just going to be able to dump in so many great photos that were just perfect. So talking about mastery, I studied Japanese in college, and one of the things that sticks with me is this one little saying, which is "Chirimo tsukoreba tsumoreba yamato naru," which is the quote there. Even dust, if piled up, can become a mountain. And mastery is all about small incremental improvements over time. And so that's a lot what we're going to be talking about, is how you can, throughout your every normal workday, find ways to make small incremental improvements to really up your game. Check mark, we did mastery. I think I put these little pauses after each section in case I forgot something I wanted to talk about. So I also wanted to define productivity within this context. So across the board, we're delivering software artifacts to customers, and there's a whole process, but the process ultimately comes down to our producers, and the major cost is the hours of time that it takes to produce these outputs. And what we're looking at for productivity is how much value are we delivering for how much cost. And if we narrow that down to the developer is making tons of choices. Even if there was lots of designs and requirements up front, the developer is making tons of choices every moment while they're writing the code, which affects the final value delivered and affects how long it's going to take to do it. So delivering maximum value per hour worked is the productivity that we're looking at. And last, this might be popping into people's minds, and so I wanted to address it up front, but I like this article a lot that this guy, Jenny Brinkman, I'm not going to murder his name, did, but if you just Google it, you can read the article or follow the link if you see it. But there is a huge amount of difference in performance that between developers, and in my opinion, every developer can hugely improve their game. I mean, some of these numbers suggest that even 10x is not the max of what you can do. And I'll go a little bit about how you can actually achieve that, but you really can dramatically increase your output in terms of value per time. And I've been kind of obsessed about this since forever, because at least when I was a teen, getting into programming, I was like, oh my God, I can build anything I ever wanted. And then I realized I didn't have the time to build everything I ever wanted. And so I started to really care about how can I get as much out as possible, because there's so much I wanted to build. And there still is. I still struggle with this every day. So that's the summary there. All right, so now we're gonna get into kind of the meat here. So I'm sort of splitting it into two groups. Productivity is about doing more with less. So we're going to talk about doing more, and then we're going to talk about doing it with less. Shameless blog plug, but really I just wanted to put up the terms. This is my blog when I update it, which is rarely, but it's got good stuff anyway. But essence and artifact is really what it's about when you're thinking about delivering value. You want to understand for the client, what is the real problem they're trying to solve? And you might be having to read between what they're saying. They may not be able to articulate it. But really, they have some outside world problem that you're providing a tool to them to be able to solve that problem reliably. And even more than reliably, it should be enjoyable and beneficial. And they should come away from using that tool feeling engaged and energized rather than drained and exhausted. So there's a lot about thinking about what's the real problem you're solving. And often a lot of the features we design are totally ancillary to the core problem. And then there's the essential solution, which is once you've identified the problem, what is the bare minimum solution that will fully solve the problem for them. And again, that certainly comes up in spec gathering and design work, and this certainly applies there too, but ultimately it'll come all the way down to the developer, and you're writing code, and you're gonna have to make decisions where you need to understand the real problem you're solving, and you need to understand the solutions. And this is part of leveling up all the time. We're looking at new tools we can use to solve things, and you're always seeing the problems people are solving. The contrary is artifacts and the artificial. It's one of my weaknesses is I don't follow the status quo at all. I'm always going off my own path. But at the same time, the status quo can really lock you into solutions which may not be ideal. And so often it's good to take a step back and say, well, is this solution actually the right solution for this problem, or am I just doing it because it's the way everybody else has done it? So and last, there's the acronym YAGNI, which people generally know. It is terrible. I hate it. It's so awkward to say. It stands for "Ya ain't gonna need it." So I came up with this other one, Zen, which I think captures it better, which is zero extra nuts. When you're building something, don't add anything more than you actually need to meet specs. And that is really hard to do because we as developers like to overbuild things. But the reality is that if you overbuild something, one, it probably will not be right for the specs, or two, the specs will change and will become irrelevant, or three, it'll just be another piece of code that needs to be maintained. We really need to strive to building exactly to the specs. Push back on the specs by all means. If you think the specs are wrong, you need to call that out. But if the specs are right, don't overbuild it. Build just to the specs as efficiently as well as you can. And oh my gosh, I struggle with this one so much. Less is more. I was not gonna have any celebrity pictures, but I ended up just having to put Jobs in here because he really is the poster child for doing less. One of the things I learned early on is that you can ship any project on time, under budget, with quality, period. It's a no-brainer. You just have to cut features. And often people don't want to cut features, but the real insight is that often the product will get better as you remove features. And that is the tricky part, because you always think you're giving up something by removing a feature. But in reality, and here's why removing a feature matters, is because most of the time your problem you're solving is one user story. And then there's all these other little side user stories like login and authentication and all these other things which really aren't about solving the user's problem. And we think that all those other side features matter, but they're really 90% of the customer's time is doing this one path. And if you can focus on making that one path optimal without the distractions of all those other features, it can be a better product. Obviously, since we're not directly shipping product, we have to work with the customer to help them understand this. But that is the tricky thing. And that's really what when Jobs famously saved Apple, he simplified their entire product line to 4 products. He said, all right, we got desktops, we got laptops, we got pro, and we got consumer. 4 products. And Apple's kind of backslid now because they got about 20 different iPads now. And who knows which iPad you need? I don't know. Less is more. So find the essential problems, find the essential solutions. And I want to emphasize again with the mastery thing, this is all about you have achieved that. You're always going to find a better way to understand the solutions more deeply and how to find a solution that is simpler or more elegant and more appropriate for that problem. All right, so the second bit, how are we going to do it with less? So solving problems with less work. First of all, I'm surprised I didn't run across the acronym DRY until my 30s or so. Maybe it just wasn't around, but DRY stands for don't repeat yourself. I would say that 9/10 of bad programming is repeating yourself. I have seen so many ways that code goes wrong, and it's usually because you're repeating yourself. Not only is it more code, so let's just pause there real quick. It is more code. And if you're trying to get stuff done more quickly, you need to do it by doing less work. Copying code seems like it is a fast solution. And I know you guys probably are above copying code, but we will still rewrite the same pattern in multiple places and think that that's okay. That still falls under the category of dry. If you have less code, then you have less to maintain. We'll get back to this. This is an important point, so I'll come back around to it. But we're trying to do less, and that's how you can do more. So if it takes you 30 minutes worth of work to do what would take you an hour, you are now twice as productive. But duplicate code also really breaks down with refactorability, because when you decide you need to change things around, the fact that you have to update code in 2 places rather than 1, or you may not even know that it's in 2 places and you only update one and not the other one, that's where duplicate code becomes a real problem. So I obsess about eliminating duplicating, not even just copied code, but similar patterns that I see throughout the code. I try to always refactor, make new modules. Sometimes I've been saying I manage like 50 open source libraries at this point, because I keep saying, oh, there's a pattern I've done 5 times. I need to make that one pattern, make some tests, set it on the side, so that when I need to make updates to that, I only have to test it in one place. But here's another one that's less talked about, which seems similar at first, but get annoyed at repetition. I would say, if anything, this is my main success at upping my game. Is from my earliest days, I get really frustrated if I have to do the same thing even twice. I did a summer job once where it was supposed to lead to more interesting tech work, but what they had me do was package printers. And I got paid by the hour, and all I had to do was package 150 printers in bubble wrap, and I found every way possible to make that go by as fast as possible, even though it reduced my revenue. And that's sort of been my theme ever since. If I'm doing a job, doing the same thing twice, then I'm starting to go, how can I automate this? Because that's the beauty of programming. You can automate anything in principle. And we'll come around to this, but I mean stupid little things. Like, I hate dealing with closed curly brackets and closed parentheses. And that's why I've moved to languages which don't have them. Little things that take up minute parts of your time, that is still eating up your time. And we're typing closed brackets and closed curlies all day long. And that is something that costs time. Now, our tools are getting better at making that particular task manageable, but that's what I'm talking about in terms of, have I done this before? Is this a task that I'm doing repeatedly? Is there a way to automate it? Get obsessive about minute details. We just talked a little bit about that, actually. Syntax errors in general. So anytime you see a syntax error, or times you run across a syntax error, that is breaking you out of flow. That is indicating that your workflow is suboptimal. My mantra is blame the tool, not yourself. The tool is somehow failing you if it can't figure out what you're trying to do. Now, granted, sometimes what you're trying to tell it is completely gobbledygook, but whenever you see syntax error, take that as a hint. That's a way for you, a moment where you go, aha, this is wasting my time. How could I have either trained myself to avoid those syntax errors in the future, or how can I choose tools that make those syntax errors not possible in the first place? Obviously, waiting for the CPU is lost time. Build times, load times, test times. Those things matter, and they build up with your project, and it is worthwhile to refactor those things periodically to get them back down so they don't waste your time.
That's when you take a nap, though.
Well, we will talk about health implications at the end, because that is important too. Sometimes, well, I'm mostly out and about, but if I was at home, I would take like 3 showers a day and a nap, because those things relax me and keep me focused. So I'm going to periodically have these red slides, and these red slides are my own personal things that I've done along these lines. So here are 3, these are actually 3 of my open source libraries, which reduce repetition that I do. More as by example than to pimp them, but Neptune namespaces automatically generates index and namespace files in every folder of your JavaScript project. So you can just include a folder, and it'll automatically include everything inside it. And everything, when it's loaded at runtime, then gets a nice hierarchical namespace based on your directory structure. The result is I spend much less time worrying about including files. Everything comes in a nice structure. I can include the root and just access things. It reduced my overhead of imports and exports by half. Art build configurator basically configures my package.json file for me. is the core thing it does, but it does some other tools. But it basically automates all of my little minutial package management that I do all the time, particularly since I'm managing dozens of open source libraries. That particular one, I was doing the same thing over and over again. So I wrote a tool for it. But package.json is an example of one of the things that drives me a little bit crazy, which is that I am definitely a convention over configuration guy. Configuration files, everything should be code. And a configuration file like package.json, you can't customize it. You have to end up writing what I did is a generator, which generates that file, but it means I end up having artifacts and other messy stuff. Right, you can't even have comments in a package.json file, which is a file where you really need comments because it's strict JSON. I appreciate the Webpack config file is just a JavaScript file. And so what I do in my project actually is just a little tiny file that references our build configurator, which then builds a full configuration based on the art build configurator configuration file, which is also code. So I can, if it gets to the point where you need to have comments or if it needs to have a little bit of code to make it configured nicely, that's what I did. We'll test bench, I'll just sort of skim past, but I use mocha.js, which is pretty standard, but it has limitations. One of the things test bench does is it also takes my F2 namespace tree and generates a suite hierarchy for my tests. So my tests are already organized in a nice structure so I can run subtests easily. It just does that automatically. And I was able to do that on top of Mocha without modifying Mocha. And there's some other things in there, but I want to keep moving on to other stuff. But just be thinking about those things. Like I was always organizing my tests. How can I streamline it so it's just automatically organized for me? Write less code. This is probably my main mantra in life these days. I'm always trying to figure out how to write less code. And to be very specific, I don't mean abbreviated names. Readability is the most important thing, but I do mean less tokens. So a full variable name is a token. I have very descriptive variable names, but I try to reduce the number of tokens overall that I use. For this main observation, which I've noticed, which is that particularly over long-lived projects, every line of code you write, on average, will be rewritten 10 times. And it will be read through 100 times. So by committing a line of code to your source tree, you are committing to 100 times that cost through the lifetime of the project. These are, of course, hand-wavy numbers, but I think that's true, roughly speaking. Because you're going to have to refactor code, and just your first time through, you're going to probably rewrite each line of code 3 times. So reducing your output, and I have a little tiny subtitle at the top, but this is the really big insight, is that code is a liability, not an asset. Companies think of code as an asset. The running application that delivers value to a customer, that is an asset. But the code itself requires maintenance, and maintenance is dev time, and that's the most expensive time. That is a liability.
If a customer were asking about pairing, don't you get less code for the money that way? And I say, or half the code for the money that way. I say, ideally, we get it.
Yeah. So the other insight this gives you is, first and foremost, write your code to be read, because that's what it's going to be done the most. It's going to be read by you and by everybody else in your team. And for me, I mean, I've been on my own for so long, but I don't remember what I did 3 years ago, and I want it to be readable. So I'm not going to dive into Caffeine Script. I presented on it here before, but this is my obsession about reducing code. I think I'm getting close to the asymptote here of getting close to sometimes 5 times better than JavaScript, which is just like 10% improvement is big. And so 5x is enormous. I love it, but I can't convince anyone to use it. I keep trying. It's really effective, but you don't have to go to Caffeine Script. You can just notice how you're using JavaScript, learn your tools. ES6 has a lot of ways you can streamline your code that were not available before. There's object destructuring and other such tools, and that you can learn how to write less code even within existing languages. Debugging. Debugging is a huge waste of our time. Ideally, we'd never do it. We'd write perfect code the first time. But the big observation here is that 95% of bugs are trivial to fix. They're usually a 1 or a couple lines fix, but they're hard to find. So the time wasted with debugging is all about visibility. It's all about being able to understand and see what your code is doing. So when you run into a bug, you can find out where it is quick. And what I found is most effective, I have a mixed relationship with debuggers. because debuggers end up being so complicated. I waste a lot of time dealing with the debuggers issues that it almost neutralize the visibility issues. You can get really good at a debugger, and that can get you there. But what I found even more effective is to build into my code introspection tools. So whenever I write a class, I have got some standard patterns I use, but I add tools that let me inspect that class easily at runtime. And that sort of becomes a team strategy because everybody has to be on board with the same strategy. But just like you build tests, I think it's equally important to build introspection tools throughout your project in a standard way that everybody can use. Which is what I'm going to show real quick here. This one's pretty quick, but I have my own console for programming in JavaScript. It just runs side by side in the current window. I'd like to put it in the actual developer part yet. I haven't figured out how to do that, but it actually just puts a hover div on the right of my runtime project. And it's only an output console. It doesn't have input, but it does some things which are so freaking useful. First one here, whenever it sees something that looks like a color, it colors it. It's silly, but it helps me so much to know what the actual color is rather than looking at 5A, 544C. What does that look like? Particularly when I'm pulling data from remote data that might have color information in it. Or otherwise, again, introspecting my code. That's super useful. This also is using my standard introspection. My standard introspection is inspected objects. I've come to the conclusion the best way, at least in JavaScript, is to have a method that returns plain JavaScript objects that describe your complex structure. Because then it's very easy to see what's going on with plain JavaScript objects. And so when I inspect an object, it gives me this plain JSON compatible structure, mostly JSON compatible, which then I can present nicely. And it doesn't have all the ugliness of JavaScript objects like underscore prototype, et cetera, all that stuff that gets in the way. But perhaps the most useful, which you guys might appreciate, was two things. One, when I log an image, I get to see it. That's also huge. But the other one you'll notice here is whenever logged a promise in your console, nothing could be more useless. It tells you nothing. It says it's a promise. Whenever I log a promise, it says, one, it's pending. And then as soon as it resolves it, it puts out the result. So I can log promises and introspect them easily. And that is huge because more and more promises are everywhere in our code. For those of you who aren't programmers, a promise is a task that isn't done yet. And if you just log it, it just says, not done yet. It tells you 0. And it's usually done a millisecond later, literally a millisecond later. But you end up having to write all this custom code to try to capture it and then log that millisecond later, as opposed to just, if it's done a millisecond later, show me. And actually, my logger is pretty smart in that you can give it any arbitrary JSON structure with promises littered throughout. It'll wait till they're all done and tell you the result. Super helpful. So yeah, write less code and work on eliminating every little interruption throughout your day. And again, this is an incremental thing. Just find one thing at a time to work on. All right, so this is the last section. This is all ultimately going to be about self-awareness. You got to up your game at paying attention to your practices. And so any of all that self-awareness, mindfulness community stuff applies here, but I'm going to try to ratchet down to just developer-specific stuff. First, it starts with observations. And so these are just a bunch of tips I've got. Find tools that automate tracking for you. So it does the work for you. I use a tool called Timing on Mac, which just logs throughout the day what apps I'm in and when, for how long. And what's really cool about it is it logs the file that I have open and the path that I'm at, or the URL. And it gives you all kinds of slice and dice and sources ways where I can say, anything that's under this URL is on that project, and I can put that all under that project. It's a great way to go back and reflect on your time spent. But it also goes, oh, I swept to the browser here 5 times. And if you went to Facebook, it tells you if you went to Facebook 5 times. It's very precise. I don't go back and obsess over it, but sometimes I'm like, well, how did I spend my time last week? And I pull it up and I look at where I spent my time, where I didn't spend my time. Was it a reasonable use of my time? And you certainly can be useful for billing, but I just mostly use it for a chance to reflect. I don't have to do anything. It just runs 24/7 all the time on my computer. And I can go back years now of information about how I've been using my time. And the tool, they've gotten a lot better. I've always worried about small shops that they're going to disappear and the tool's going to get abandoned, but it's actually gotten a lot better recently. And they've switched to a subscription model, which I find encouraging because it probably means they'll have a continual cash flow, which means they might stick around. intentionally plan time for your introspection. If you don't plan it ahead of time, it probably isn't going to happen. One tool I use is a really great iOS app called Do. It is the best reminder app because it nags you until you say you did it. Most reminder apps will remind you one time, and then if you miss that reminder, you're done, and you missed it. But Do, you can completely configure, like once an hour or once every 10 minutes or whatever. I use it for all my stuff, and I've got several things throughout the day which remind me to take a time for introspection. You can tell it to repeat automatically, and it also has basic calendar schedulability. Like I've got things like I need to clean my coffee machine every 3 months, so that's in there. But the main thing is it reminds me until I tell it it's done. And when it comes up, I'll like bump it like one day for like a week. It's like, I haven't gotten to it yet, but it reminds me every day, and then I get it done. Constant note-taking. I should have a whole talk on my note-taking strategies, but pick something and take notes whenever you run into one of those little things. Like, oh, it's a syntax error. Pop a little note, and then don't even go back to work. It doesn't have to distract you other than, oh, I just wasted 5 minutes with this syntax error. Note, keep going. And then later, you can come back and look at your notes and say, oh, I did that syntax error 25 times last week. And maybe there's a way I can make that better. And I strongly encourage upping your Git commits by a factor of 10. I Git commit every time I test pass. If you want to not push ugly Git commits to a common repository, you can do a Git rebase before you commit them. But the team will have to figure out what you want your Git repository to look like. But I so often need to, it's a big deal about being able to roll back. But sometimes I'll screw something up and I don't know why. And being able to roll back just to an earlier version in the day is a big deal. But it's also a great reflection tool because each time you commit, you're putting a little note on that about where I was, what I did. Part of upping your number of Git commits is even when you're ready to commit, break it into 5 commits. Go, oh, well, this is a nice little thing here. Commit that, describe it. That's a nice thing, get that and commit it. It gives you much more ability to see what you were doing and for other people to see what you're doing down the road. It's just great. You're already doing it. It's already part of your workflow. I actually, for my entrepreneurial job, my partner at the end of the year says, all right, we need to expense your time throughout the year. You know what I do? I go to GitHub and I measure how many commits I did in each project. And I said, all right, proportionally, this is probably about how much time I spent in each project. And it works. All right, get inspired. There's lots of ways to do this. I love finding a project I find interesting and cracking it open and seeing how they do stuff. And in particular, just look for opportunities to say, oh, well, the way they did it made sense for them, but I would do something different. And just making that mental thought ups your game. You've probably heard people say, learn a new language every year or every 2 years. And I think that's certainly good, but I really think it is worth trying to write a programming language. If you get the right tools, and I can help you with that, it doesn't have to be for real use. Just the process of going through, and it can just be a couple-day project of writing a language completely shifts your perspective on what your tools do and what they could do for you. It's a very powerful learning exercise. And the other thing I do just across the board whenever I'm stuck on ideas, I often go to a magazine stand and just browse anything that jumps out at me. It could be, I could be doing a difficult, complex algorithmic problem and I'll go, wow, look at that red banner on that magazine. That's cool. And I'll pick it up. It just puts new stuff in your brain, gets your brain fresh, and allows you to come back to whatever other thing you were doing, inspired and moving forward. And nowadays, you go to a magazine rack and it's just overwhelming amount of stuff. And you just let go of opinion and just grab whatever jumps out at you and look at it. I see nodding over here.
I have a tradition where I take all the high school seniors that I know to Bulldog News on the app sometime during their senior year. And I tell them to just walk through, pick up magazines that interest you, read the contents, the table of contents, and just start exploring things because it's a great window into so many, the current state of so many different fields. And as they're approaching college and what to major in, I've had some amazing conversations result from that ritual of just and then I have them buy the top 2 that really interested them, and I have them read all the articles, and it's really fun.
Yeah.
It's good.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I was going to warn you guys early on. I also put this in the Slack message, but I want to try a little thing at the end of the talk, which we're not quite there yet, where people have the opportunity to just, I'm going to call it picks, and I'm going to just pass the mic around. You can pass if you want to. If there's just something interesting you found in the past week that you'd like to share, just take 30, 60 seconds to say, this is this. You can read more about it here. I found it interesting because of why. And I think that's a good way for people to share across the company interesting stuff they're finding throughout the week. So ultimately, all this logging is only useful if you actually go back and review it. I don't quite do an end-of-day self-review, but it gets the concept in place. You want some regular time for reflection. I don't have a real structured time for it, but I just end up finding I do it semi-regularly. And part of what I end up doing is organizing my notes. Like, again, if I was just saying, if you take a note each time that this sort of thing comes up, go back periodically, particularly if you tag your notes in some way. So you can just go, oh, syntax errors. And you can just go, like, how's all the syntax errors that I've seen over the past week? Are any of those things I can do something about? And one thing I have found is it's nice. I mean, these note tools let you edit old notes. And sometimes I'll edit a little bit to clean up typos. But I would mostly recommend leaving your old notes as they are, because that's a capture of a slice of time. But write a new note that summarizes and references the old notes. And then take action. Ultimately, think about ways that you can make a little dent in wasting a little less time during your day. That is how my caffeine script programming language came on. I was like, I was not going to write another programming language, not going to write another programming language. And for a year, I just threw notes in Evernote, and actually I got to about 200 notes, and I was like, I actually know exactly what this thing looks like, and I need it. So I got to that point where I was going to write it. But it doesn't have to be writing a programming language. It could be something really small. It could even be just changing your patterns. But remember, you are wielding programming languages, and the world is information, and programming languages are how you automate information. And so you are literally superhuman. You are a human plus a computer. You can do more. It is incredibly empowering to start realizing that you can automate away a lot of the things that trip you up. So my last slide is thinking beyond the code, which broadly speaking is lifestyle and health. And you're using your brain and your body, and you maximizing that matters too. And all this stuff is stuff that you'll find in a million other places. There's nothing original here, but taking care of your health. I was going to call that mindfulness practices, but really it comes down to mind quieting practices. Giving your mind a time to be not thinking about everything literally opens up space in it so that you can come back and be more productive doing, whether it's work or it's your personal life. That's if you like well-researched stuff, meditation and mindfulness practices have a lot of research behind them these days for their effectiveness. Taking a little bit of time for that can make you really more effective in the rest of your life. But I'm also, you'll see this less often, but I, again, really believe in outside stimulation. Every which way you can do it. Music and smell and texture and taste, and finding ways to keep yourself in an inspired state, because when you are programming, the best state is when you're in flow and you're inspired. And inspiration doesn't always come from being in an office and staring at a wall. But of course, all these things, everybody's different. Everybody has to find their own mix that works for them. That's why it's an iterative process. You reflect on yourself and you make the improvements, and in small little ways, and have a little bit of faith that little improvements, it's like, interest, right? You get 1% interest on an investment, even 1% compounded is huge. And that's representation. So we talked about mastery, about just the incremental improvements. Productivity is both about delivering more value. So thinking about the real problem and the essential problem, the essential solution. And I think about Platonic ideals when I think about that in terms of this. You can look up Platonic ideals if you haven't studied those. It's not quite the same, but it is sort of in abstract, like there's no better solution, period. Like this is the maximally best solution to this problem. But you really have to understand the problem really deeply to be able to say that. And it's an ongoing practice, but that allows you to really focus on that specific problem to that customer solution. Doing more, so we just talked about mostly doing with less, is mostly about eliminating the wasted parts of your time, which is all the little distractions throughout your day. And some distractions are good, right? Because they take a moment for reflection or take a moment for inspiration and so forth. Those can be good at keeping your productivity up. But a lot of them really just break you out of flow and make you slower. So then we just talked about the self-awareness practices. So that is the presentation. Thank you. I do want to try this PICS thing. I think it might be useful for just as an everyday thing for us doing tech talks, but right now it's just an experimentation. So I will kick us off real quick. Oh, yes, the questions. Yes.
I had a question on the note taking. I'm curious. I have a couple thoughts on this. I'm curious why you use Evernote, or why you use Evernote. I use Evernote, and I use a folder of text files that I load up in Atom, and I have 2 of those. And I use Evernote,
Yeah.
and I use Google Notes. What made you? I'm surprised as a big Mac advocate that you are. Maybe I know more than other people about you, that you're not using Apple Notes. And I'm curious on how you got there, because maybe I might go that path.
I have actually started using Apple Notes more. Was it a year ago? About 6 to 12 months ago, they made a major improvement to Apple Notes. Apple Notes has gotten a lot better in terms of formatting. I want a little bit of formatting, but not a lot for my notes. I want bullets. I want to be able to put images in there. Evernote falls far short in a lot of ways. I wish they would get a clue because the editor is kind of clunky. It's not great for popping code in, which is often what I'm doing. I want to just copy a little snippet of code and put in there for the future. And it's just because it's a clunky editor. There's no excuse for it. And I would love to pay for Evernote. I don't, but all the reasons why they want me to pay are irrelevant to me, and if they would just fix their main editor. But that said, I can get my notes from everywhere. The searchability is really good. And I actually, on my phone, I use a different app which syncs with Evernote, which has a better interface. They're sort of the best of the worst, the worst of the best. For me at the moment, Microsoft's OneNote is too much. But my friend uses it. He is writing a novel entirely in OneNote because it gives him the flexibility he needs for writing a novel. And I don't advocate for one tool for everybody. Everybody's got to find the tool that fits them. Google Notes is too little, is what I found. So Evernote is close. I wish it was a little bit less fancy in its formatting. I'm so often copying and pasting things in Evernote, and it copies all the formatting over. It's like, I just want the text. So I wish they would simplify their formatting and clean it up a little bit. Like I don't want to pick fonts from all possible fonts. I just want to pick one monospace font, one serif or one sans serif font, and I don't want to think about that when I'm making notes. Notes needs to be really, well, I also keep a paper journal. And so often I will sit down with a paper journal because machines get in the way sometimes. What I hate about paper journals is they're not searchable, damn it. There are some technical solutions out there that kind of get there. There are pens that will record what you write, or there's special paper that has dots on it so it can be scanned quickly, but I just use a paper journal. But mostly it's the searchability and the accessibility everywhere, and it has the right amount of expressiveness for me.
Yeah, I use this like text files for forever, and I've found that that's really good because you can get it into a tool. If I put them into Atom or to VS Code, then I can use Markdown files. I can search those really nicely, and then I jump between like 3 different OSs all the time,
Mm-hmm.
and so that makes that easier. But then when I try to get on my phone, it's like, what type of tool can I use that I can use this with? And it's like, it's just too weird. And yeah, so I hear you.
It's not ideal, but it's decent, and it's better than nothing. I heard a great term, actually. It was when I first heard about Evernote. They were talking about it, and they called it their exocranium. And now I have a whole folder on my phone, which I call exocranium, which is just all the ways things that I could be thinking in my brain, I can unload it into something. My to-do list and all these other things that normally you'd be keeping in your head, but putting it somewhere I can access from anywhere.
I heard somebody call that a memex. I use that term.
Yeah.
It's kind of the same thing.
Yeah. Any other questions? All right, so I'm hoping that we'll have at least 1 or 2 other picks besides mine, but we're just gonna pass the mic around. My pick, although obviously I've given you guys a few picks, but I just wanna give an example. I use an app, another little productivity app, but this one's just kind of fun, called Color Snapper. It's actually Color Snapper 2, but allows you with a shortcut to basically eyedrop anything on your page. But what's great about it is it immediately copies it into your clipboard. And so you can just go paste it anywhere, and you can choose any of like a dozen different standard color formats, hex or RGBA or any number of other things. So you set it in whatever mode your code currently uses, and you can just go and snag colors from anywhere, toss it in your code fast. It's just a handy little tool.
Okay, I'll grab that one.
Color Snapper. It's for Mac, yeah. But just knowing that tools like that exist, there's probably something good for Windows as well. Anyone else have a pick?
I have a couple. One I got from you, Shane, called Divi. I use Divi a lot now, and all it does is sets up hotkeys so that you can snap your window on Mac to any size and location that you want. So I use option 1 snaps it to the left half of the screen. Option 2 snaps it to the right half. And if I have 2 windows and I hit option 1, option 2, or command, it's command 1. Command 1, command 2, then I have 2 windows set up instantly to look like compare across both of them. So that's really nice. The other one I have for iOS is called Wunderlist. It's an amazing list app. I've had it forever, and I just keep all of my lists in Wunderlist. It's all it is dumb, list something and then check it off when it's done. But you can share with a spouse or another person. So those are my picks. Wunderlist.
Yeah, me too, actually.
Maybe it's Wunderlist.
Wunderlist. It's a Microsoft product now, if you didn't know that.
Yeah. Sure.
Yeah, I guess I've got 2 quick picks. One thing I've been focusing on recently is just kind of finding new ways to just sort of change perspective on, both audio and visual fronts. So on the audio side, I'll recommend the Elisa Strike multipad thing. Strike multipad. It's a sampler you could use if you're on stage and has a bunch of cool sounds. One thing that was really neat was figured I'd try something really bizarre as an example. So I took several cymbals, threw in the sound of a quacking duck, and reversed it. And it actually was an unexpected treat that is probably going to make its way onto the next album, which is kind of cool. That was by dumb luck, but hey, it's worth a shot. And the other pick I have is this great book from the Full Stack IO group on D3 with data visualization and charting. And currently cranking through that, and I'm pretty impressed, especially looking at things such as accessibility with different graphs. So when you're using a screen reader, right, you could tab into a certain part of the chart and get some meaningful info. So yeah, visualization and audio fun are my 2 recommendations.
I've been using Tableau Public a bunch to just, it's like a better, I don't want to pay for it, but it's free. And it's just like way better than, I love Excel and I love pivot charts, but Tableau just does it better.
Kind of relating to the subject about having little distractions get in your way. I started doing a technique where I batch little stuff. So I basically start off with a sticky note on one of my desktops on my computer, and it says, are you inventing things to do instead of doing what you need to do? Or are you inventing things instead of doing the important? And then if the answer is yes, I'll just add that to like my batch list. Or if it's like checking emails, or if it's like I need to pay like this bill, or I need to check on this thing, instead of like worrying about it and turning it in my head, add it to the batch list, maybe like once a week, go through that batch list and hit them all in a row so you don't have that context switching delay between stuff. And that's been helpful.
That's awesome.
Yeah. Yeah. That technique, other recommendation is you were on talking about note-taking apps. I use Bear, and I find that to be really simple and clean.
Yeah, I've looked at Bear too, and there's a lot that appeals to me because it's very much get out of your way, so you can really focus on just getting your notes done. All right, I think that's great. Thanks everybody for doing the picks. I think that's great. Is there one more?
I got one. Duolingo. I mean, I've been doing it for, I think my streak is like 410 days. And it's like, it doesn't feel much at first. Like my partner was like making fun of me because I couldn't pronounce anything or do anything. But like, it's just constant, right? And that's what gets you to learn something. And it's easy now, like, because I just wake up and do it while I'm laying in bed and I don't get out of bed. And I'd spend that time doing something terrible, and now it's productive. So it's great.
Yeah, I totally did all that. I've been doing it for years now, and it just.
You got through the Spanish. You completed it.
Yeah, I did complete the Spanish one. I landed in Mexico and was living there for 3 months. But when I landed, I didn't know any Spanish other than just what I picked up. I just started doing Duolingo. And
Phil Mitchell developed what he coins as the most effective Spanish learning app on the planet. It might be interesting for us to evaluate that. I don't know. We got to ask Phil.
Oh yeah.
Oh, you wrote it.
He's got opinions. He also wrote
Cool. Well, that was perfect, guys. Thank you so much. That was a good talk. Good audience participation.